Well, this week, or throughout this whole summer, we've been taking a look at some of the various stories or parables that Jesus offers to tell us what life is like in the kingdom of his Father. And the truth is, you can tell a lot about someone, especially yourself, by figuring out which of the characters in each of these stories that you most identify with. A Sunday school teacher was teaching about the prodigal son in one of her classes, and she said to the class, "But there was one for whom the return of the prodigal son brought no joy and celebration. There was one who experienced only disappointment and bitterness and resentment. Who was it?" One of the children raised their hand and said, "The fatted calf." Now, I don't know if that story is true, but if it's not, it ought to be, because you really can learn a lot about yourself by figuring out which of the characters in these stories you most identify with. And this morning, we're going to take a look at the second son in that famous story of the prodigal son. He's the oldest son. And truthfully, he's the one I most identify with. You see, I'm the oldest son in my family of 5, and I know what his life, at least I think I know what his life was like. I know what it's like to try my best to be the responsible one in the family, to take care of all the other kids. I know what it's like to try my best to do the right thing, to have people think well of me, as they must have thought about that older son who, after all, didn't go to that far-off country, didn't squander the family property, but stayed home and worked with his father. I understand a fair amount about the older father, or the older son, and I identify in many ways with him. Because growing up, I dated, when I did date, the right girls, chose the right school to go to, even entered the right profession. I didn't go off to that distant country, at least not outwardly. See, I grew up in a small town in southeast Michigan, and when you're in high school in southeast Michigan, the distant country is Toledo, Ohio. It is, sorry. It's just over the state line, and in the promised land of Ohio, the drinking age was 18. Fake IDs flowed like milk and honey in my day. But I didn't go to that distant country. I had lots of friends, prodigal sons and daughters, if you will, that did. Part of the reason I didn't go was I really did want to do the right thing. Part of the reason I didn't go was I was just too afraid to go. Part of the reason that I didn't go was I was worried about people who would drive home drunk. Part of the reason I didn't go was because I had this air of smugness and superiority by not going. So I know a little bit about this older son. And I'm going to suggest to you that he suffered from a malady, a syndrome that I'm going to call the older brother syndrome. And that's what I want to look at to begin with as we look at this passage this morning. Now, again, this is the second half of this famous story of the prodigal son. And in the first half, the prodigal has finally come home. His father has welcomed him with open arms. He has offered the fatted calf and put shoes on his feet and a ring on his finger. And by the time this conscientious older son, who's been working faithfully and hard all day, at the end of the day comes home, as he approaches the house, he can tell right away there's a party going on there. Now, if all had been well in that heart of that older son, he would have immediately entered into the party and into all the joy that surrounded it. But right from the beginning, He is suspicious of it all. He asks somebody, what's going on? Someone says, your brother just got back. Your father's killed the fatted calf. That much food indicates that this isn't just some single family celebration. This was a celebration for the whole village. Everybody in the village was there that day, feasting with the music and the dancing that would go well into the night. And then we read verse 28. So the older brother became angry and refused to go in. And herein, let me suggest, lies the first symptom of this older brother syndrome. He has a heart choked with resentment. See, this older son resented the fact that his brother had left in the first place, and he resented the fact that his brother had repented from his failings. He resented his father for welcoming him back home. And he resented the whole village for joining in this homecoming. And this resentment is seen in his refusal to enter into the joy. Now, joy is one of the major themes of the entire chapter of which this parable is a part. In this chapter, chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 different parables, and each of them are all about joy. The first story is one in which a shepherd loses a sheep. And verse 5, and when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders, goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. In the second story that comes right after that is the story of a lost coin that a woman finally finds, verse 9. When she finds it, she calls her friends together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. And then Jesus, after those 2 stories, says in verse 7, I tell you in the same way, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who don't need to repent. And just in case we missed it, he says it again in verse 10. I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So then we get to this final story of the lost son. And in the last half of the parable that we're looking at today, we find that after the younger son has come home, the father embraces him, gives him the ring, the shoes, and kills the fatted calf. And then verse 23, bringing the fatted calf and kill it, let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. So in this chapter, everyone's celebrating. The shepherds are celebrating together. The neighbors of that woman are celebrating. All of heaven is celebrating. The angels, it said, the father, the prodigal son, village is gathering in this chapter, and everyone is celebrating except one person. He's not celebrating. He is choked with resentment, and he refuses to go in. But while he won't go in, the truth is, in another strange way, he is enjoying himself. He's enjoying his resentment. He enjoys sitting out on the front porch, listening to the music but not going in, feeling this air of superiority, this sense of righteous indignation for it all. Let me tell you how resentment works for those of us who wrestle with this older brother syndrome. In the Arctic, Arctic hunters who are on the hunt for wolves, they'll take a slab of raw meat and they will impale in the meat their sharpest knife and then leave it there. And when the wolf comes and begins to wolf down the meat, he eats it so greedily that when he gets to the sharp edge of the knife, it ends up splitting his tongue. But because it's cold, and because the wolf is in such a frenzy about it all, because he's starting to smell blood, not knowing it's his own blood, he begins to consume it with rage. And it tastes so good to him, and he keeps splitting and cutting his tongue. He keeps bleeding so profusely that he eventually bleeds to death. He destroys himself because of his own appetite. Frederick Beaker writes this: of all the 7 deadly sins, anger is probably the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, or to roll your tongue over the prospect of bitter confrontations, or to savor the toothful morsel of pain that you are given or the pain you are giving back. In many ways, anger is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. See, there's a party going on. Jesus wants us to recognize that's the kingdom of God. That's a picture over and over in all these parables of what kingdom life is like. And some of us are like that older son. We are sitting out on the front porch, resentful because of stuff that's happened to us or somehow doesn't feel just to us. Maybe you have a parent who just didn't quite live up to your expectations, as no parent ever quite does. Or a spouse that hurt you, as every spouse will. Or a child who disappointed you, as every child will. And the truth is, some of us are enjoying the resentment. It is something that feeds our sense of moral superiority. And I will suggest to you, if you find yourself in that place today, you are at the cusp of that knife that's about to cut you open and drain out all the love and the joy that life is meant to have for you. That's the first of the signs. The second diagnostic sign of this condition, let me call something that's seen in the verse 29. But the older son said to his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you, never disobeyed your order, yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. All these years I've been slaving for you." Can you almost hear the whine in his voice? This son of yours, he goes on, comes back, he gets the fatted calf. He gets big wages for doing bad. I get no wages for doing good. That's not fair. That's the heart of the older brother. So show of hands right here for this. How many of you have had 2 children or more? If you're a parent, have 2 kids or more, just raise your hand. Yeah, and how many of you have ever heard one of those kids claiming that the other child got to go to bed later, got a bigger portion of whatever it was they liked the best at the meal, got a milder punishment for the same infraction, or got a better present at Christmas time? From a book in Sibling Rivalry, a mom writes about her children. "I'll never forget the summer day I decided to tackle the big freezer in the garage and to get rid of 2 years built up of frost. The kids were in bathing suits watching me, bringing out pots of hot water to loosen the ice. At one point, everything began to melt, so I playfully tossed a big slab of ice in the direction of the youngest child. Here, have some ice. Immediately, the other two chimed in. What do you think they said? I want some too. So I grabbed 2 more slabs of ice and slid them toward the 2 others. Then the youngest yelled, they have more. You want more? I said. Okay. So I threw a pot full more of ice at their feet. Then the 2 older ones shouted, now he has more. So 2 more pots of ice in their direction. The first one cried, now they have more. By this time, all 3 children are ankle deep in ice and still yelping for me. As fast as I could, I flung huge chunks of ice at everyone's feet, even though they were hopping up and down in pain from the cold. They continued to scream for more ice in the frenzy of not wanting one to take advantage over the other. This older brother, goes through his life perpetually unappreciated, he's sure, a victim of all this injustice, which, by the way, is the second symptom, I'll suggest, of this older brother syndrome, a belief that they are always underappreciated. Now, the older brother secretly, I suspect, thinks that the prodigal brother of his has indeed had more fun in that distant land, secretly believes, or at least suspects, that life just might be better in that far-off, distant country. So he says to himself, look, if I've got to be home with the Father, if I've got to walk the straight and narrow, if I'm going to give up all that fun, I ought to at least be compensated for all of that. But instead of rejoicing at God's goodness to another person, the older brother is focused on the fact he's sure he always gets the short end of the stick. Verse 20, look, when this son of yours, the older brother says, who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Notice how the older brother refers to his younger sibling. Not this brother of mine, this son of yours. See, son of yours is a phrase that would be used by someone that's outside the family. Your neighbor would say, how's that son of yours doing? When you use the term son of yours, you're recognizing that you're not part of that family. He's not a part of you. And that's how this older brother felt, cut off from the rest of the family, judging that younger brother of his as someone that's not the same as him. See, judging is not what someone points out in me that I've done wrong. I do lots of things wrong, and believe me, I got plenty of people that let me know that's the case. But when they do that with me knowing that they are for me. They do it with me knowing they want me to grow and to flourish. Judging is when I speak from a distance and feel no compassion towards you, feel no obligation to help you, secretly, frankly, enjoy when you fail, and experience a sense of righteous indignation that I'm going to be the watchdog to make sure that everything's done correctly. And so I adopt this posture wherever I go in life of suspicion, of judgmentalism. In fact, that's the third symptom that's infecting this brother. It's a posture of suspicion and judgmentalism. And so here's that older brother out on the porch that afternoon. And yeah, he actually is singing. But the song he's singing is one called Annoying Grace. Do you know the lyrics? Annoying grace, how shrill the sound that saved a wretch like thee. I ne'er was lost, I'm always found. Me blind? Say, can you see? Through many damsels, joints, and dares, you have already come. Disgrace you've brought, dad's gone too far, and welcomed home a bum. And that's the heart of this older brother. So what does God have to say about this older brother? What does he respond, and how does he respond to him? What is his response to this heart of a son who, by the way, is every bit as lost as the one who left home? Well, this son refused to join in the celebration. Verse 28 at the end, so his father went out and pleaded with him. So the son, the older son, wouldn't enter the party, enter into the joy, and so the dad goes out to plead with him. Now, this is a far more serious thing than we today might think. To Jesus' original audience and listeners, well, this was a shocking thing to do because the oldest son, the older brother, was by his status in the family the master of ceremonies, the co-host of all the parties that were offered in that home. And so it was his responsibility, along with his father, to mingle with the guests, to make sure everyone's drinks were filled, they had enough food for everyone. This was what he was to do. And if he did have an argument with his father, he would be expected to kind of deal with that privately later, because he was the MC for the party. Because back in Bible times, especially, coming to a banquet when you're called was a big deal. Some of you know the story in the Old Testament in the book of Esther of a queen by the name of Vashti, who was the king's queen, and she refused to come to a banquet when she was called to it, and as a result, she lost her throne. And so the older son, by not coming to the party, is conspicuous by his absence. And by refusing to come in, he publicly humiliates his father. When his father has to excuse himself from the party to go out and to speak with his older son, the father is just humiliated in front of the entire village. But this isn't the first time, by the way, that day, that the father has been humiliated. Do you remember the first part of the story, how it was that when the son, the youngest son, comes home, the father runs to him as his wayward son? And remember how we said that great men never run in Bible times, running and weeping with joy. This guy does anyway. Gathers that returning son into his arms, throws his arms around him. See, the father breaks all the rules of decor when it comes to how he welcomes home the prodigal son. And the whole village was shocked by that expression of things. That's not how you deal with a foolish son. But the father didn't care. He had his youngest son back. But now he wonders, as the party begins, did I gain my youngest son only to lose my oldest son? And so the father once more humiliates himself, goes out, leaves the party, pleads with the oldest son to join the festivities. Do you know what the father is saying? He's saying, I'll suffer humiliation for you too. I suffered it for the youngest, the prodigal. I will suffer it for you. I love both of you. You both matter to me. Hebrews 12, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. Now, the father didn't have to go out and plead with his son. He could have had one of his hired men just go out there and order the kid in. He could have done that. I mean, he had every right to do that. And the son understands that was the case too. But see, the father didn't want him to come in because he was forced to, any more than God wants you to come to him from some kind of external sort of thing. He wants your heart. You can't be forced into his family, into his kingdom. There's a door to your heart, but only you hold the key, and God Almighty will not force the door open. So instead of forcing the son to come in, the father goes out to him. Verse 29, he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you." See, in his bitterness, the older son, he doesn't even address his dad as father. I mean, the prodigal son had done that at least. Even the prodigal had some level of respect for that. But despite the disrespect, the older son, the father responds, "My son." This is verse 31. And that word that Jesus uses in the story is an unusual word for son. There's a regular word that's used for son, but this one is a different one. It's a word that speaks of tenderness. It's almost like calling your kids dear child, I guess is as close as I could get. A tender, affectionate term. See, and what the father is saying here is, I want you to be my son, not my slave. I don't want you slaving for me all your life out in the fields. I want you to be my son. You are always with me, verse 31 at the end, and everything I have is yours. See, remember, the younger son had taken his share. Now, everything that's left, all that is still there in the home and part of the family, the father says, all of this belongs to you. Every sheep, every goat, every door, every nail in the house. You're always with me. You've always been with me. But look, I offer you everything. I offer you myself. I've been there for you all these years. But if living at home with me is not enough, then all the parties and all the properties and all the goats in the world are not going to be enough. I've always been there and always will be there. And by the way, that's the third thing the father says to the older son. Everything you need has been here all along. See, that's the problem of us older sons. We think it's always on our shoulders, and we've got to carry the world on our shoulders. But what God is saying is, all along, I've been God. You've just been invited to join in the celebrations, which leads to the last point as well. It's not too late to join in the joy. It's not too late to join in the joy. We had to celebrate, be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. See, the father is infinitely gracious with this older son, and yet at the same time infinitely firm. He will not apologize for celebrating the return of his younger son. He won't stop the party as the older son wants. The older son doesn't have that kind of power. And then he ends the story. Here's the last verse of the story. We had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, just for a moment, let's step back and remember who this story was told to. At the beginning of the chapter, we're told that tax collectors, sinners, were all gathered around Jesus to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were muttering about how he spent time with all these wrong kinds of people. And so as these people, these two groups, these folks who are the outsiders of the culture and the people who are the prominent insiders, as they listen to the story, as the tension and the drama of the moment occurs, suddenly the outsiders, the tax collectors, the sinners, as they hear the story of that prodigal son coming home, they realize, well, that was me. I was the one that was lost. I was the one that was in the far-off country, but I'm invited back home. And in similar light, as the Pharisees and teachers of the law are listening to this part about the older son, they realize full well who Jesus is alluding to. But see, then, all of them stop and wait with bated breath to see how the story will end. What will the older brother do? And at that moment, at the climax of the story, Jesus simply walks away. He doesn't finish the story. The next verse is chapter 16, where we find him talking to a whole different audience. He never finishes the story. So why doesn't he finish it? Well, it's not because he couldn't come up with an answer, couldn't come up with an ending. It's because the ending had yet to be written. It's because all of those listening to Jesus would have to finish the last chapter of the story themselves. Now, the same is true for us. We have to decide how the story ends. Now, the story can end one of two ways. One way is that after this father says he was lost and is found, one way it could end is for the older brother, the older son, to turn from his father, walk off the porch, return to the field, spend the rest of his life living in coldness and bitterness of heart, never having fellowship again with the father, maybe continuing to do his work, following all the rules, but growing to not only hate his younger brother, but secretly growing more and more to hate his father as well, and one day dying all alone. The story could end that way. It really could. Or it could end another way. It could end that the older son sees in his father's eyes the love that he has for him and his younger brother both. He has suffered humiliation for both. He has pleaded with both. He could see that kind of love. He could let that soften his heart, and then he could enter the house where he would see this skinny, emaciated, skeletal face of a person that he barely recognized. But then, after a moment, realized that this was the same brother that he had grown to love over the years, that he'd played with in the fields, and he had worked in the fields with, and learned to do life with. And he could think about the fact that brother was almost lost from him forever. But now he would never have to be apart from him again. And so instead, his heart explodes with joy and love. And he throws his arms around that prodigal son, that younger brother, and joins in the celebration. And he's the one that laughs louder and sings longer and dances faster and cries harder than anyone in the house. And those two boys are reconciled to their father. And the celebration goes on, because good things need not come to an end. So how does the story end? It's really up to you. Maybe today you're one of those sitting on the outside front porch, filled with a sense of resentment that life hasn't been fair for you. Someone else has gotten a better break. You've always gotten the short end of the stick. But will you learn to just let God be God and rejoice with those who rejoice? Will you look for people this week that you run into and will you celebrate their successes with them? Maybe send a card to let them know that you're so glad about that promotion or the success that their child has had at school. See, will you have the heart of the father or the heart of the older brother? See, the problem is, it's actually fairly easy for people to go from being the prodigal son to the older brother. You find yourself rescued by amazing grace. And it's not too long before you're singing annoying grace. And so the question is, will you remember the gift of God's life and love? It is always there for you. You are always welcomed into his home, and celebrate that gift he has for you today.